Good morning. Welcome to the Atlantic Council's virtual convening series, Elections 2020, America's Role in the World. My name is Capricia Penovic-Marshall, and I am the Ambassador in Residence and Senior Advisor at the Atlantic Council and a co-convener of Elections 2020. This series aims to highlight and explore the key national security issues and challenges that will define the agenda of the next administration, whether Democratic or Republican. Elections 2020 brings to our viewers a bipartisan virtual stage featuring informative and in-depth conversations on key matters concerning America's role in the world. Among other subjects, we will address the rise of China and great power competition, US global defense strategy, energy security, and the collision between democracy and authoritarianism, just to name a few. We will draw on the most prominent voices and decision makers shaping the national conversation to address these subjects and debate America's interests and leadership on the global stage. We also want to thank Samsung for powering this series. Monday, we launched this exciting series with a lively discussion featuring former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Tomorrow morning, we will be hosting a conversation on cybersecurity with the always insightful Michael Chertoff and Jane Hall-Lute. Tomorrow afternoon, we're hosting Derek Mitchell and Kurt Volker for a fascinating discussion on the ongoing battle between democracy and authoritarianism. We have more great events planned for the rest of the DNC and RNC weeks. Our viewers can find the latest lineup of speakers and sign up for each event on the Atlantic Council's website at www.atlanticcouncil.org/elections2020/. Follow us on Twitter at Atlantic Council and engage in this important conversation using the hashtag #ACElections2020. This morning, we have a phenomenal panel dealing with a complex topic, exploring the instability created by the profusion of advanced technologies and weapons of mass destruction, and how the next US presidential administration can flex its diplomatic muscle to contain them. The COVID-19 pandemic raised the specter of biological weapons, further complicating an already frail security environment in which state and non-state actors alike have access to increasingly lethal capabilities. In this environment, how can the US advance and protect its interests and values? What threats should the next presidential administration prioritize, and what role does diplomacy have to play? To examine how the United States should address these divergent threats and emerging powers, we have an impressive panel. My dear friend and former colleague, Ambassador Wendy Sherman, and Dr. Kori Schake, along with our moderator, the one and only David Sanger. David is a national security correspondent and senior writer with the New York Times. He has been on 3 journalistic teams that have won Pulitzer Prizes. His latest book, The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age, addresses how large and small states use cyber to compete in the international arena. A very insightful read, if I may, which really underscores how he is an ideal moderator for this discussion. David, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Capricia, and thank you all for joining us today. It's great to be here with both Wendy and Kori, 2 great practitioners, scholars, and good friends. They don't need much introduction, and it's all available to you on the screen. But Kori served in the Bush administration, has been in a number of fascinating posts, and most recently now at AEI. And it's great to be with her. Wendy, of course, was the counselor to Madeleine Albright, is in the Albright-Stonebridge group. When she served in the State Department first when Secretary Albright was serving, and then, of course, came back as Undersecretary for Policy when she spent a good deal of her time, among many other things, negotiating the Iran deal. Remember the Iran deal, Wendy? So we spent a lot of time in Vienna and other locales around the world. So we're going to discuss emergent threats, but it would be I'd be wrong if today, Capricia, if I didn't start by asking our two panelists about last night, which was supposed to be National Security Night at the convention. Wendy, you saw your old boss, John Kerry, speak. Colin Powell came out. Corey, somebody you've spent a lot of time working with over the years. And so I just wanted to start with the most general question, which is that the convention had to make the case that Biden was ready to go take over. But of course, the world that he would take over if elected is going to look a lot different than the one that he left on January 20th, 2017. We've got a much more poisonous relationship with China. The Democratic Party has moved far to the right of the Republicans on Russia, or certainly of the Trump administration on Russia. North Korea's got a third to a half more larger arsenal than it did at the beginning of the Trump administration, and the Iran deal is pretty shattered. So, Wendy, tell me if you think they made a sufficient case, understanding that conventions are no place to talk policy.
Indeed, conventions are no place to talk policy. Look, I think they made a very strong case last night. And the case was that this is a candidate who has, his long history is actually an advantage. This is someone I was thinking, partly because of an event I did yesterday, he has met with every prime minister of Israel since Golda Meir. And some people may see that as a disadvantage that he's been around. I see it as an enormous advantage because he has seen change before. He has seen that the world is not the same world that it was when he began as a US Senator at the age of just 30 years old. The world has gone through tremendous change. He went through the Vietnam War. He went through seeing presidents have to resign their office. So this is a man who understands that the world does not stand still, that it does change. But the point that was made last night is that we are strongest when we ourselves are strong. We are strongest when we live our own values and show the world that we're going to live those values. And we are strongest when we work with others, when we strengthen our alliances, look after our own interests, of course, but make sure that we do it with others. If we're going to confront China, as I think everyone wants to do, around the ways in which it creates disadvantages for the rest of the world and tries to change the rules of the game, then we will do it if we are strong in our own economy, strong in our own military, strong in our own diplomacy, but even stronger if we do it with our partners and allies. And I think that case was absolutely made last night. And finally, the last thing I'd say, understanding this is a nonpartisan event, is that the current president has, in my view, taken every step to isolate America from the rest of the world. We learned in 9/11, which Corey understands quite well, that we are not isolated from the rest of the world, that the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean does not make us an island. We have to understand we are interconnected, and the pandemic has certainly brought that home again.
We'll get back to the pandemic in a minute. Corey, you were early on in the group of Republicans who basically signed what became known as the Never Trump letters, right, back in 2016. What was interesting is that at that time, Colin Powell was a lot quieter. And then, of course, we saw him show up yesterday. And it struck me that the message of having Powell there was to try to appeal to a group of moderates, people who might identify themselves as Bush Republicans, to see if they could bring them back. But of course, that's the group that by and large wanted to go sort of shatter the establishment approach and ended up helping elect Donald Trump 4 years ago. So was the Powell move effective to your mind, or do you think that in the end it may not make that big a difference given the hardening of positions around the country?
So I do think Secretary Powell is an effective spokesman for establishment Republicans who are deeply concerned about the choices that President Trump has made. But I reject your notion that those of us saying in 2016, we're really worried this presidential candidate is reckless and we believe dangerous to the republic. I don't think us saying that deserves blame for getting him elected, David.
No, I'm not suggesting that there was cause and effect there. I was just saying you didn't bring over many members of the party.
That's true. What I know as a historian of the 19th century is that the United States isn't newly a country full of reckless, risk-tolerant people who occasionally elect reckless politicians. I do think, though, that the 2020 election is really important because there's a fair amount of tolerance among America's friends in the world for the fact that we occasionally want to shake up our own political system by electing outsiders. And most other democracies are nervous about the way anybody could get elected president of the United States, that you don't have the same kind of party control. But if we re-elect President Trump, that will affirm the choices of the last 4 years. And I support Ambassador Sherman's description of them. They've actually been incredibly damaging to America and the world. And reaffirming those by re-electing President Trump will convince America's friends and America's adversaries that we're a very different kind of country than we've wanted to be in the last 70 years, where we have been the guarantor of the international order.
Corey, let me just follow that up with one other, which is you wrote a terrific book called Safe Passage, which described the move from British hegemony to American hegemony a century ago. And that was also a time when people were very nervous about what the United States was doing. We took the Philippines, we took Cuba, and so forth. And it was decades before we sort of took on this sort of what we regard as a more benign role. I'm not sure the rest of the world does, as the guarantor that you described. Is it going to take decades? I mean, whether President Trump wins or loses, does it take decades to get that confidence back again?
It's so interesting that you frame it in terms of confidence, David, because I think that's true. If you look at the people of Hong Kong or the people of Belarus struggling for their freedom against repressive governments, they believe in the truths we hold to be self-evident. And I think the loss of confidence among the free societies, in part because of the mistakes we made in the Bush administration after 9/11, in particular, choosing to fight the Iraq War and the bad management of the Iraq War, but also the 2008 financial crisis, strengthened the argument that the Chinese and other repressive governments tried to make, that the instability and kind of roller coaster of free societies are something their people shouldn't want. And we're not making the assertive case anymore that yes, it's a wild ride, but it's absolutely better to be able to elect your own government and throw it out of power when you're not pleased with what they're doing.
Wendy, before we turn to the emergent threats, we had one other development yesterday that was pretty interesting, which was that we got the 5th volume of the Senate Intelligence Committee report. I think probably the last bipartisan group that's actually sort of working and functioning on Capitol Hill, maybe in Washington altogether. This was a Republican-led report. It was 1,000 pages long. But what do you think we learned from this about the Russian interference in the election that we didn't know from the Mueller report, the books, the articles, the thousands and thousands of pages shed on this topic for the past 4 years?
Well, first of all, I think it is quite extraordinary that this was a bipartisan report, that it was signed by Republicans and Democrats. It is a staggering indictment, in my view, of the extensive contacts between individuals in the Trump campaign and Russian operatives. It further deepens our understanding of what Paul Manafort was doing, and it's quite concerning. But it also indicates that there are multiple members of the campaign, whether knowingly or unknowingly, had extensive contacts with people who were Russian intelligence officers. I think it also tells us what we have heard, but in even more detail, that Russian interference is continuing. There has been a lot of discussion in the last few days between Trump officials and Biden campaign officials about whether, in fact, people are interfering. But the fact, and it's reinforced by this report, the Russians are very decidedly interfering in profound ways that you, David, understand even better than Corey and I do, because you understand the cyber world so well. The Chinese and the Iranians may have views about who they want to be president, but there is not the extensive and deep evidence of the range and depth and breadth of interference, in literal interference, in our election process. And so we all have to be and remain wary. So we may be weary of this story, but we can't be.
One quick follow-up for you.
Can I chime in?
Sure. Go ahead.
I was just going to add 2 quick points to Wendy's. 2 things I found astonishing about the Senate Select Committee report. The first, that they recommended to the Justice Department and to the Mueller investigation the indictment of 4 members of the Trump campaign, including Jared Kushner. Those people were not subsequently indicted. I think it's interesting. The second thing I thought was really interesting was that none of the Republicans who recommended those things in the Senate Select Committee report actually voted for the president's impeachment when those charges were brought in the Congress.
Yep, that was interesting. A very quick question for you, Wendy, because I really want to turn to some of these technologies. You know, when I read your memoir, Not for the Faint of Heart, which is a great both personal story and a great story of your time in the State Department, you know, I was struck, as I've been struck by the memoirs of everybody who left the Obama administration, about how little understanding there was within the Obama administration in the last year about the extent to what the Russians were doing. You know, our radar really was off. And I was wondering, in reading that, in the back of your mind, was there anything running that, boy, talk about emerging threats that we're not thinking about, that you were just discussing the wrong topics relating to Russia in that last year?
I don't think we were discussing the wrong topics. And in fact, Russia was discussed, and there was a review of Russia policy. And I remember Mike Mullen, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, talking very extensively about the threat that Russia was not only to the United States, but to the world, and what they were trying to do around the world. But I think we had a lot on our plate that we were trying to get done. And whether it got all of the attention it should have, whether it got the extensive attention it should have, obviously, in retrospect, we all wish we had known more. But I think it's wrong to say, David, that it wasn't something that President Obama wasn't focused on, Susan Rice wasn't focused on. They were. Certainly our intelligence community was. But we were just sort of absorbing all of this. And it was also very tricky because we were entering a campaign season. And pushing this agenda may have seemed like an agenda as opposed to information and a way to affect the campaign. So I think the White House had a very tricky dilemma on its hand about how much to discuss publicly, how much to try to make sure our intelligence community was aware of, and what they were going to do about it. So I think it was a very hard moment. I think a lot will be written about what does one do as a sitting president, as you're about to head into an election season, when you are aware of these things. And a warning was given publicly, but it was subsumed by other news in our very fast-moving.
That was the afternoon of October 7. I remember it well. It was
I'm sure you
a
do.
warning, and a half hour later was the tape of the president, and a half hour after that was the first WikiLeaks release of John Podesta's emails. So we have
I want to pile in on that because, David, I don't think journalism should get off quite that lightly of saying they remember it. The relentless coverage of what was in the emails purloined from the campaign. We wouldn't treat stolen diamonds the way we treated stolen information, and all of the coverage of it. This was such a new issue, but everybody was making it impossible not to pay attention to what was the Russian objective to get us all to focus on. So,
well, Corey, I think you're right on that, and
do a very good job, any of us.
We're guilty as charged. I think in the media, when I think about my own coverage, I was writing about the Russian hack. In fact, we broke a lot of those stories, but we were also writing about the content of the emails. And I don't think we did a good enough job sort of warning readers, hey, you are reading this because Putin wanted you to see these emails, which I think is something we've discussed a lot in newsrooms, and I'm not sure that we've quite figured out how you solve that problem. If in fact
we've all gotten better. I mean, we hadn't anticipated having that problem, any of us.
So we've got two big emergent threats that I think that we're looking at for the next president, or for President Trump if reelected, to go deal with, going in simultaneously. One is that the pandemic, as Capricia noted before, has reminded us of a lethal technology that in the case of COVID-19, we believe came out naturally, but it's been a sign of how vulnerable we would be to a biological weapon, something we haven't really discussed as a country since the anthrax attacks, back after 9/11. And then we've got all the vulnerabilities that have come out in the cyber world that we've seen from the Russian election, but not simply from the Russian election. So Corey, let me start with you on the bio threats out of this. How should we be thinking differently because of the pandemic about how we're defending against biological threats? You saw this White House and the Obama administration struggle with the question of whether you have the same teams dealing with naturally occurring pandemics and biological weapons. Trump administration merged those offices together. But as you look at it more broadly, what would the President Trump in a second term or President Biden in a first term need to do differently here?
Well, I think President Trump is unlikely to do what I recommend.
I'm shocked.
But I do think that the choices this administration has made, the America First approach to these problems, is the equivalent of Jeb Stuart looking for supply wagons at Gettysburg instead of providing the kind of strategic intelligence that will allow good leadership choices. Because what international institutions and deep cooperation between scientific communities, medical communities, intelligence communities creates for the United States is strategic depth. You have good visibility into where threats are emerging, into whose laboratories we should be nervous about, and that espionage should be going on to make sure that we understand what's happening there. So what President Trump has done is narrow the circle of visibility by the aggressiveness and kind of empty belligerence of an America First approach. That, I think, is a really important thing to change in the Biden administration, and I'm confident they will do so. The second thing to do differently is, stop talking dangerous nonsense from the White House podium about America's health. People have actually died because of the president's willingness to take crackpot theories to the presidential podium. And I am struck during the pandemic about how much a difference it makes to have the White House as a reliable conveyor of safety information for the American public that governors can pick up on, that local authorities can pick up on, that help individuals make smart choices for themselves. And in something like if somebody, God forbid, were to release something dangerous into the water system in New York City, it would really matter that you could rely on the federal authorities to inform us all very quickly about what we need to be doing.
So, Wendy, I'm going to ask you a similar question here, but just beforehand, I wanted to remind our viewers out here that you can put your questions in Zoom using hashtag AC Elections 2020. I'm sorry, you can do it on obviously just using your hashtag fashion, but you can go into Zoom as well on the Q&A and put your questions there. So, Wendy, it's not as if the Obama administration was not looking at this threat at the end of, I guess, the summer of 2016. There was a big after action report written on the question of how they had handled two previous pandemics, neither of which struck the United States. The Trump administration, to its credit, ran its own simulation called Crimson Contagion in 2019 that was based on an avian flu virus that was coming in from China and hit Chicago and so forth. We've written about all of these, and yet we're looking at a United States that has done remarkably worse than other wealthy nations around the world. So as you've written before, we're absent a strategy here. What does that strategy need to be?
So this is also, it's like an echo that keeps coming. I was a member of a congressional commission on the prevention of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism in 2008, headed up by Senator Bob Graham and Senator Talent. It was a bipartisan effort, and one of the things that came out of that report was a concern about whether we were ready for biological threats and how unprepared we were. I think that the Obama administration tried to up that game by creating a White House office to focus on pandemics, by creating in the State Department an equal effort. I think our intelligence community began to look at this as a real issue, but clearly we have a lot of work to do. And one of the things that's happened now, and one of the things we must do in the future, is return to science. There are no science advisors in the Trump administration. Science seems to have been lost and set aside. And I'm all for people's instincts. I believe in my own instincts, but I always test my instincts against facts and against science. And we don't do that anymore, and the Trump administration certainly doesn't. I think the other thing that we have to do is international organizations are not perfect animals because they always are, the whole is the sum of the member parts. So they're never perfect and they're always difficult. But the United States leaving the World Health Organization is one of the stupidest decisions because it is one of the World Health Organization collects information from all over the world, creates capacity all over the world. We helped them out with the Ebola crisis. And that meant that only 2 people died here in the United States. And most of the Ebola crisis, sadly, remained in Africa. But it also means we have a seat at the table as science develops, as we understand more about what happens in the world, as we investigate what happens in the world. And when we leave, as we have left the WHO, what happens is China puts up $2 billion to really be a powerful seat at that table, and tries again to replace us as the leader who sets the rules for how we conduct ourselves in the world. So those are among the things that I think we need to do. But at the heart of all of this is science, because whether it is technology in the pure sense, cyber, space, AI, quantum computing, how we build our innovative economy for the future, it all comes back to science. And I certainly urge every young person these days, if they're not comfortable with science, find someone who is, because partner with them, you're going to need them.
Corey, in bio, of course, it's a defense game, as you spent a lot of time in the Pentagon dealing with. In cyber and information warfare, it's both an offense and a defense game, and a resilience game as well. What strikes me about this particular era, and particularly in the Trump years, is we haven't figured out the deterrence part of this. For all the things that the Obama administration did, and some that the Trump administration has done to the Russians, to the Iranians, to the North Koreans in the information, and particularly the cyber arena, we don't see a diminution of attacks. And we just saw the intelligence community a week and a half ago warn that all three countries are likely to be back in for the election. So what would you tell an incoming administration or a next term of the Trump administration that needs to be done to sort of reestablish deterrence here, or establish deterrence? We've never had it.
Okay, so that's a great question that I'm going to turn back on you after I give you my answer, David, because you know more about it than I do. My advice to an incoming administration would be use the tools of free societies to protect free societies. Use transparency, exposure, journalists following the money, economic sanctions when you can prove, cooperation with allies, in particular the Five Eyes allies who have the closest intelligence sharing relationships, to see if they see what we see. Build public-private partnerships so you can share trusted information about what you see happening and what our big tech firms see happening. So that would be my advice, but what would your advice be?
Well, one of them would be some more radical transparency here. The intelligence community often gets hung up, understandably, on the idea of protecting sources and methods, and that's the way they think about most traditional threats. The result has been that even in the election season, what we're hearing from the intelligence community about what the Russians, or most recently in their latest warning, the Chinese and the Iranians might be up to, has been very vague, so vague as to not be terribly useful in arming the American public to sort of think about the disinformation. And what they've got to get their minds around, to my mind, is that for this data, the client is not the President of the United States. It's not the Congress. It's not Wendy when she was getting her daily intelligence briefing, in the morning at the State Department. It's actually the American public. And so in the cyber arena, once you've stripped out the how you heard about it, and that sometimes is difficult, what I would do is move to a presumption that it's declassified and make it expensive and difficult to actually make the data classified. Because the thing that's going to push people back is the discovery of the route. Now, you're seeing the NSA do a better job of this. They turned out on Friday a fairly technical but really detailed warning about a new Russian form of attack that was being run by the GRU, the Russian military intelligence, and what it would look like. It went on for pages and pages, and it was exactly what they needed to do more of, but they've got to get out and declare that. Now, it doesn't help if you've got a president who then says this is all a hoax. And, I think that undercuts and makes it very difficult for the intelligence community to go out and do this for fear of getting in trouble. That would be my solution to it. Wendy, what's yours?
I think you know more than Corey and I do about this subject, and I agree with you with that radical transparency. I think the public at large is split about a lot of this. because of some of the misinformation that has come out during this administration that sort of ignores some of what we know about cybersecurity. When you have the President of the United States basically saying everything is a hoax, it begins to undermine Americans' ability to absorb information, to understand it, to read what the New York Times is saying, and decide whether it is fact or fiction. Most people that are younger than certainly me, and probably you and Corey as well, don't live their lives with the same news sources that we have traditionally used. And so we're going to have to quite consciously penetrate those devices and that understanding. Most young people believe there is no privacy. I believe privacy is quite important. And so we've got a national discussion to be had about how we want to regulate our technology, how we want to regulate our information, to create that radical transparency, absolutely. But for people to make decisions about what they are comfortable and with what they are not comfortable with sharing. Our stock market right now is being surged by technology stocks. It was announced this morning that Apple is now worth $2 trillion. That is an outsized power and impact on our economy, on our information, on our society. And we have not come to terms with what we want the corners of that frame to be.
Now, if you took the capitalization of Apple and Google, Microsoft, of course, Amazon, you'd have something that would be, right up in the top rank of countries. Wendy, there's a question that's come into you from Stephanie Cook. The question's this: the U.S. overwhelmingly lost its bid to extend the arms embargo against Iran. This was in the Security Council vote last week. I think we got one vote in the Security Council. It was from the Dominican Republic, and looks to be set to launch snapback, a provision that you helped get written into the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran deal. What chances do you see of success that this snapback will happen? And what are the implications for Iran and its own participation in both the Iran deal, but more importantly, the NPT, if in fact we do the snapback?
So I believe that the United States, having left as a participant in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, as President Trump has said, we are no longer a participant, does not have standing according to the deal that was reached, that I was honored to lead a team to be a critical part of the negotiation, along with a lot of other people, including the president and John Kerry and Ernie Moniz and a phenomenal team and all of my partners at the table from other countries. So I don't think the United States has standing to bring snapback. I believe they will try anyway. I think there will be a lot of backroom procedural discussions. At the end of the day, even if the United States decides it's going to prevail in some manner, I don't think they will have the support of the Europeans, who have already said they do not believe the United States has standing to bring this snapback. So I think this will end with a whimper, not a bang. I think procedural discussions will mean that even if the United States somehow prevails, and I don't know how they're going to do that, I don't think any of the rest of the P5 or the Security Council, except maybe the Dominican Republic, will pay attention to what the United States has done. And I think that's a problem of tremendous significance, because if the United States, in essence, misuses the veto power or misuses the undermining of multilateral sanctions, then the Trump administration is taking away two powerful tools for itself and for succeeding administrations. I didn't think the day would ever come when I would agree with John Bolton on anything. I He said there's never been a war he didn't want to wage, and as a first resort as opposed to a last resort. But nonetheless, he wrote a Wall Street Journal op-ed arguing that such U.S. action would undermine U.S. use of the veto and the use of sanctions. And on that, I agree with him.
So, Corey, Wendy's made a if a tree falls in the forest argument here. And so the question is, if we declare the resumption of UN sanctions, which is essentially what snapback would do, would go back to the sanctions that existed before Wendy and her team negotiated this, and no one follows along. If our NATO allies who are on the negotiating team, Germany, Britain, and France, the rest of the European Union, certainly the Russians and the Chinese don't. Have we, in the end, actually undercut our own authority at the UN? Would most Americans care, given what they think of the UN?
So most Americans wouldn't care because most Americans aren't dialed in very carefully to the issues of snapback sanctions at the UN for the Iranian nuclear weapons program. But that's not the right standard. The reason those of us who are experts pay attention is so the broad American public doesn't have to. And what I think Iran policy generally shows is that the Trump administration is bad at diplomacy. It shouldn't count as diplomacy to loudly, angrily repeat your maximalist demands. What counts as diplomacy is getting other people to agree with you. And the administration has failed to do that, as the UN vote shows. The last thing I would say on this is that the United States has had pretty severe sanctions on Iran since about 1979. And what brought
really well, I think.
What brought Iran to the negotiating table for the JCPOA was that the Obama administration got European countries to agree to a common set of sanctions. That had I would defer to both you and Wendy, you who covered it, Wendy who helped negotiate it, but it looked to me like the Europeans agreeing to the set of sanctions with the Obama administration was what brought Iran to the negotiating table. And so having others agree with us amplifies our own power, and we alone aren't particularly capable of affecting this problem. And that's what the Trump administration doesn't seem to understand.
So we're just about out of time, but I want to end this with a question we have from one other attendee who asked whether we can achieve any kind of permanent bipartisanship on U.S. national security strategy and foreign policy. I would argue we've never had permanent bipartisanship. But that Russia report that Wendy was talking about earlier is the one sign that you may get some bipartisanship on an understanding of facts, even if the Republicans and Democrats differed on the interpretation of what that meant, which you could see from the impeachment vote they did. Do you see any interest in the two parties in actually going back to a kind of more bipartisan approach to foreign policy? Or has what's happened in the past, I wouldn't even say 4 years, I would really say in the past 8 or 12, created a wedge in which foreign policy becomes as divisive as domestic? Wendy?
I don't think it has to be as divisive. Clearly, what happens in the Senate in this election will be crucial as to whether, in fact, we can achieve bipartisanship. I think that on Russian sanctions, there was bipartisanship. On sanctions on Saudi Arabia, there was bipartisanship. There was clearly bipartisanship in this report, even if Republican members aren't willing to come out and take then decisive action as a result of it. Because I think they're all so cowed by the fear of a presidential tweet destroying their chances for re-election that they've left behind common sense. I hope that once we get past November 3rd, I obviously personally believe that Donald Trump should go and Joe Biden should be president. I hope that people will return to some common sense and remember that we should be more about country than we are about party. And I think that was part of the message last night in having people who are both Republicans and Democrats speak to national security, to have that extraordinary series about John McCain and Joe Biden's friendship. They didn't always agree, but they understood each other and they worked for country. And I do hope we can return to that.
And Corey, let me ask you to give a final thought on the same question, but with a particular focus on China, because what strikes me is that if there's bipartisan accord on anything these days, it's both parties running to show which one would be tougher on the Chinese, which might take us to a place we don't want to be. So pick up on that if you can.
I do think there's strong bipartisan support that China is behaving in ways that argue for stronger, more assertive American policy. I think there's strong bipartisan agreement that that needs to be done in close cooperation with allies, that it needs to not just be a military response, but also an economic and political and cultural response, an ideological response. I think that, I always liked President George W. Bush's statement about that we ought not to judge our adversaries by their worst examples while giving ourselves credit for our best intentions. And there's been too little of that in how we craft foreign policy in the US. We actually agree on a whole bunch of stuff. If you look at the way the House of Representatives moved to prevent the president from having the money to withdraw troops from Germany or South Korea, the support for NATO.
Or continue sanctions on Russia.
Yeah, there's actually quite a lot of bipartisanship. And if we would stop listening to the worst examples and empowering the worst examples, and remember that we shouldn't be judged by our best intentions, we would get a lot further on this. And I agree with Ambassador Sherman that the section about John McCain and Joe Biden was a reminder of all of those things last night.
Well, I want to thank you both, Corey, Wendy, Capricia, whose new book, Protocol, you shouldn't miss, or memoir of the State Department and beyond. And I'm glad we had a chance to kick off this great series at the Atlantic Council. I thank you both for a great conversation. I suspect it won't be the last one on this topic between now and Election Day. Thanks very much.
Thank you.